1842, Carolina. The woman who led the trafficking and murder of African Americans haunts American history. In the fall of 1842, a fisherman casting his nets along the muddy banks of the Blackwater River near the border of Virginia and North Carolina made a horrifying discovery that would unravel one of America's most gruesome criminal cases. His net snagged on a heavy object, and upon inspection, he found a rusted iron box half buried in the riverbed. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a young woman, her bones bearing the marks of brutal violence. This discovery exposed the operations of Eliza Lizzie Warwick, a woman whose name would soon become synonymous with terror throughout the Tidewater region. For over a decade, Lizzie Warwick operated a secret network that historians would later call the Tidewater Trap, a conspiracy that lured free African Americans and escaped slaves with promises of safe passage to the north, only to betray and sell them into slavery on the cotton plantations of the Deep South. But Warwick's operation was not just about human trafficking. She was a ruthless killer who eliminated anyone who threatened her empire, from rival traffickers and local witnesses to even her own accomplices. Court records from Southampton County, Virginia, show Warwick was indicted for 6 murders, though local whispers claimed her number of victims approached 30. Before we delve deeper into this tale of treachery along the Blackwater River, where are you reading this story from? Warwick's network stretched from Richmond to Mobile, Alabama, touching countless communities. Share your location in the comments, and don't forget to follow to uncover more dark tales from America's past. The discovery of the iron box at the bottom of the river would ultimately unravel a criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade, shielded by jurisdictional ambiguity, societal indifference, and the cruel fact that most of its victims were people whose disappearances were never investigated by the authorities. The Blackwater River region was a haven for criminals in the early 19th century. Situated on the border between Virginia and North Carolina, the area fell on the fringe of Southampton and Hertford counties, where legal disputes created a lawless no-man's land. The area, known to locals as the Dark Corner, was named for a ramshackle tavern that would later become Warwick's base of operations. Dense swamps and thick cypress forests shrouded the landscape, with the Blackwater River providing secret waterways to transport captives under the moonlight. The nearest town was a day's ride away, and the sparse dirt roads were often impassable, making it a perfect sanctuary for those evading the law. Lizzie Warwick, born around 1795 as Elizabeth Ann Carver, arrived in the Dark Corner in the 1822 after marrying Thomas Warwick, a small-time trader of tobacco and timber. Their simple log cabin, perched on a bluff overlooking the river, concealed a maze of secret compartments and a fortified cellar used to hold prisoners. Thomas was a quiet man, seemingly unaware of his wife's descent into crime until it was too late. His mysterious death in 1838, rumored to be at Lizzie's own hand, left her in full control of the property and free to expand her illicit trade. The house, from the outside, appeared to be the humble dwelling of a farming family, with rough-hewn timber walls and a shingled roof. But what the few passers-by could not see was the purpose-built underworld beneath the floorboards and behind false walls. Narrow passages, windowless cells, and iron shackles bolted directly into the earthen floor, ready to hold the unfortunate souls who fell into Lizzie Warwick's hands. But beneath the tranquil facade of the Riverlands lay a brutal reality. The 1808 ban on the importation of slaves from Africa had sent the price of labor soaring in the South, where the cotton boom demanded ever more workers. A healthy adult could be sold for $1,500 in markets like Natchez or New Orleans, creating a lucrative black market for human lives. This insatiable demand turned opportunistic criminals into ruthless human hunters. This economic transformation turned border regions like the Tidewater of Virginia and North Carolina into a fertile hunting ground. After the Revolution, many enslaved people had been freed through emancipation laws or the will of their former owners. As a result, a significant community of free African Americans had formed, working as boatmen, farmers, and artisans. However, Their freedom was nominal. They lived in constant fear, lacked legal protection, and were scorned by white society. The legal status of free African Americans in the early 19th century was extremely precarious. They could not vote, testify against whites, and were required to carry papers proving their free status at all times, papers that could be easily stolen or destroyed. Their disappearances were rarely investigated, as local authorities often dismissed them as vagrants or runaway slaves. For a cunning predator like Lizzie Warwick, these vulnerable people were not just victims, they were an untapped resource. Stepping into this dark world was Lizzie Warwick, a woman who would prove that cruelty required no physical strength. Contemporary accounts describe her as a wiry woman with piercing grey eyes and a voice as sharp as a razor. Lizzie stood just over 5 feet tall, but she commanded fear through her cunning and ferocity. Neighbors recounted her ability to be both charming and menacing depending on the situation, often posing as a benevolent Quaker to offer aid to free black families. The mysterious death of her husband, Thomas, in 1838, rumored to be by Lizzie's own hand via poison, left her in sole control of their riverside property. By that time, she had already begun to consolidate her empire. Law enforcement in the dark corner was almost purely nominal. County sheriffs often avoided the treacherous swamp and its reclusive inhabitants. Isolation was Lizzie's greatest ally. Farms were miles apart, and the sparse community consisted of outlaws, debtors, and families who just wanted to be left alone. People learned not to ask unnecessary questions, especially about the wagons that came and went at night from the Warwick farm. This indifference created a protective cocoon, allowing her crimes to fester unchecked. Lizzie Warwick's transformation from a cunning widow to a criminal mastermind was accelerated after she partnered with Amos Reed, a former riverboat captain with deep connections to southern plantation owners. Reed was more than just a kidnapper. He was a logistician of evil, running the Dark Corner Tavern and managing the transportation of their cargo down the Blackwater River to seaports. Their partnership was a deadly combination. Lizzie, with her talent for deception and identifying prey, would plan the abductions. She often posed as an abolitionist, approaching free African Americans with promises of escape to safety in Pennsylvania. This cover allowed her to access the most vulnerable communities, gathering information about families, their travel routes, and when they were least protected. Meanwhile, Reed and his henchmen would provide the brute force necessary to execute Lizzie's plans. Lizzie's early methods were cunning and cruel. She preyed on the desperation of her victims. A favorite tactic was to send forged letters from northern cities like Philadelphia or Boston, promising well-paying jobs in wealthy Quaker households. For free African Americans struggling to survive, these offers were nearly impossible to refuse. They would pack their few belongings and travel to a predetermined meeting point, only to fall into the hands of Lizzie and her gang, stripped of their freedom papers and shackled. The first documented murder linked to the Warwick gang occurred in 1839, marking a brutal turning point in their operation. A rival trafficker from Tennessee named Caleb Morse passed through the dark corner with a large sum of cash, around $10,000, to purchase slaves. Believing Amos Reed's tavern to be a safe stop, Morse boasted of his wealth. It was a fatal mistake. Under Lizzie's direction, Reed plied Morse with whiskey until he passed out. They then robbed him of his money and dragged him to the banks of the Blackwater River. Later testimony from a gang member revealed that Lizzie coldly ordered them to finish him. Morse was brutally beaten, and his body was stuffed into a stone-weighted iron box and thrown into the deep current. This murder set a new precedent. The Dark Corner was not just a human trafficking hub, but a deadly trap for anyone with something worth taking. Unlike previous cases, the disappearance of Morse, a white man with business connections, began to draw unwanted attention from the outside world. However, instead of being afraid, Lizzie took this as a learning experience. She realized that eliminating rivals was not only profitable, but also consolidated her power. She began to refine her methods, ensuring that every trace of her victims, from their clothing to their horses, was destroyed or sold in distant places. The lesson Lizzie learned was not to stop, but to become more ruthless, more efficient, and to never leave a witness. The death of Caleb Morse was not the end, it was the beginning of her true reign of terror. Lizzie's partnership with Amos Reed, elevated her operation to a new level of efficiency and brutality. Reed was no mere thug. He was a savvy underworld businessman who understood the river routes, the slave markets of the South, and the psychology of both hunter and prey. He brought to Lizzie what she lacked, an infrastructure. Reed's Dark Corner Tavern, situated right on the Virginia-North Carolina state line, was a masterpiece of criminal strategy. The building was intentionally constructed so that one part sat in Southampton County, Virginia, and the rest in Hartford County, North Carolina. This geographic advantage was their ultimate shield. When a sheriff from Virginia arrived with a warrant, Reed simply had to move his prisoners and accomplices through an internal door into the North Carolina section of the tavern, where the Virginia officer had no jurisdiction. The tavern was the nerve center of the Tidewater Trap. On the surface, it was a dilapidated but seemingly legitimate stop for boatmen and weary travelers, explaining the constant traffic of strangers. But that was just a facade. It was a temporary prison where victims were held in horrific conditions awaiting the next shipment. It was also the gang's boardroom, where plans were hatched, profits were divided, and betrayals were punished. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its dual nature. The upper floor was a crude public space with a bar, a few wooden tables, and a couple of rooms for guests. But beneath the floorboards lay a living hell, a series of cellars and sub-cellars, accessible only through hidden trapdoors under rugs or behind liquor cabinets, were designed for holding human beings. The air was thick, lightless, and sound was muffled by the thick earthen walls. Iron rings embedded deep in the stone walls were used to chain prisoners, and buckets in the corners served as their only toilet. The gang that Lizzie and Reed assembled around them was a collection of societal outcasts, each with a specific role. It included white drifters like Samuel Holt, a large man who provided muscle, a cunning free black man named Isaac Wells, who served as a decoy, convincing other families to trust the promise of a better life up north, and even a corrupt local constable who provided information on upcoming patrols and investigations in exchange for a cut of the profits. This diversity was a deliberate strategy. Isaac Wells could gain the trust of victims, while white members like Reed and Holt handled transactions with wealthy slave buyers in the South. Isaac Wells, the free black man who served as the gang's decoy, was an invaluable tool in Lizzie's scheme. Described in later documents as a soft-spoken and seemingly trustworthy man, Wells had the ability to infiltrate free African-American communities without raising alarm. He would spin moving tales of the good life in Boston, of high-paying jobs, and the respect they would receive. With his sincere demeanor, he could persuade even the most skeptical. This chameleon-like ability made him the ideal recruiter, identifying desperate families and leading them straight into the Tidewater Trap. As the 1,830 seconds progressed, the scale of the Warwick Reed operation grew frighteningly. Their network reached far beyond the Virginia swamps, with established connections to traffickers in major port cities like Charleston and Mobile. They no longer targeted just single individuals, but began to target entire families. They would lure parents with the promise of a bright future for their children, knowing that children and teenagers were especially valuable on the market. A child could be trained and would provide decades of unpaid labor, making them a lucrative investment. Lizzie's gang maintained a cruel intelligence system. They monitored communities, taking note of who had just lost a crop, who was in debt, and who had healthy children nearing adulthood. They exploited every vulnerability, economic, social, and emotional. They knew that hope was the most powerful weapon and the most effective bait. One of the most harrowing accounts of their cruelty comes from Hannah Green, a 22-year-old seamstress who was kidnapped in 1840. Her testimony, later recorded by abolitionists, describes being lured by Isaac Wells with the promise of a job at a dress shop in Norfolk. Instead, she was taken to the dark corner, stripped of her papers, and chained in the tavern cellar for 3 months. Hannah recalled the near-total darkness, the soft weeping of other captives, and the stench of despair. She was fed scraps and brutally beaten when she dared to ask about her fate. It was only through the pity of a young tavern worker who secretly slipped her a key that Hannah was able to escape into the night, carrying her horrifying story to the outside world. Her deliverance marked the beginning of Lizzie Warwick's downfall. Hannah Green's account revealed horrific details of life inside the Tidewater Trap. She described being gagged, bound and thrown into the bottom of a wagon, specially designed with a secret compartment. The journey lasted 2 days in suffocating darkness, with only occasional stops for a sip of water and a piece of dry bread. Upon arrival at the Dark Corner Tavern, she was dragged into the cellar, where the real horror began. She recounted that the cellar was always packed with captives, sometimes as many as 20 people, who were sorted and chained in separate areas. Men on one side, women and children on the other. The conditions were deliberately engineered to break the human spirit. Darkness, starvation, and constant humiliation. The psychological torture was worse than the physical, as captives had to listen to the screams of those being beaten and knew their fate was to be sold far away, forever separated from their families. Hannah also described the gang's systematic processing procedure. All evidence of a victim's identity was destroyed, freedom papers were burned, clothes were replaced with rags, and they were forced to learn new names and stories. Those who resisted were starved or whipped with a cato, 9 tails, until they accepted their new slave identity. It was a methodical process of human erasure. Lizzie Warwick's operation was an open secret in the Dark Corner. The sparse local population knew about the muffled screams that came from the tavern and the shadowy wagons that left in the dead of night. But in a society where black lives were devalued, no one spoke up. The victims had no voice in the eyes of the law, and the already weak law enforcement was often paid off by Amos Reed to look the other way. The community's complicity went beyond silence. Some local farmers provided information on free African Americans passing through the area in exchange for a share of the profits. Shopkeepers in the nearby town sold chains and padlocks to Reed without a single question. An entire criminal ecosystem had formed around Lizzie, fed by greed and racism. This indifference was only shattered when the gang became too greedy. They didn't just kidnap African Americans, they began targeting rival white traffickers who carried cash. These men, while engaged in a brutal business, were still recognized members of white society. When they started disappearing in the Dark Corner, their business partners and families demanded answers. Their disappearances created a shockwave that the loss of hundreds of black people before them had failed to do. The first case to draw the attention of the authorities was the disappearance of the Tennessee slave trader, Caleb Morse, in 1841. Morse was known to have entered the Dark Corner area with over $10,000 in gold coin, a fortune at the time, with the intent to purchase a large group of slaves. He was last seen drinking at Amos Reed's tavern. Weeks later, his distinctive horse and saddle were identified at a market in a neighboring county. When questioned, Lizzie Warwick coolly claimed that Morse had sold the horse to her before taking a boat downriver to New Orleans. However, Morse's business partners in Tennessee did not believe the story and began to pressure Virginia authorities to launch an investigation. Morse's disappearance established a dangerous pattern for Lizzie's gang. Unlike the hundreds of African American victims whose passing was marked only by the silent grief of their families, white men like Morse had business networks, assets, and political connections. Their disappearances left paper trails and questions that could not be easily dismissed. Lizzie's method for dealing with these wealthy targets was simple and brutal. She and Reed would welcome them to the tavern, feigning friendship and business cooperation. They would ply the victim with alcohol, extracting information about the money they carried and who they were traveling with. When the victim was off guard, they would be murdered, often with a blow to the head or a knife in their sleep. Their bodies were dumped in the Blackwater River in heavy iron boxes, while their money and any human property they possessed were absorbed by the gang. The profits from these murders were immense, allowing Lizzie and Reed to expand their network, bribe more officials, and hire more henchmen. Eliminating competitors also helped them solidify their monopoly on the illicit human trade in the region. But this very success began to draw attention. Abolitionists in northern cities like Philadelphia had begun to note an alarming pattern of free black people disappearing after accepting job offers in the South. Vigilance committees started offering rewards for information on kidnappers, and whispers of a deadly trap on the Virginia-North Carolina border began to spread. The pressure, though slow, was building from multiple sides. The rewards began to tempt those with guilty consciences or disgruntled gang members, and the wall of silence Lizzie had carefully constructed began to show its first cracks. Lizzie's response to the growing pressure was cold-blooded brutality. Instead of exercising caution, she became more reckless, believing that the only way to protect her empire was to silence all potential threats. Anyone, gang members, local witnesses, or even victims who showed hesitation or knew too much, was at risk of becoming the next victim. This decision to tighten her control through violence ultimately hastened her downfall, as it sowed fear and dissent within her own ranks. Lizzie's mindset grew increasingly paranoid. She had built an operation that generated enormous profits, reportedly earning tens of thousands of dollars annually, a staggering sum. But this wealth came with the constant fear of discovery. She trusted no one, not even her closest allies, and saw potential traitors everywhere. The central figure in Lizzie's undoing was Isaac Wells, the free black man who served as the gang's decoy. Wells had joined Lizzie in the early days, tempted by the promise of money and security in a dangerous world. Initially, he may have justified his actions to himself, but years of witnessing relentless cruelty had eroded his soul. Wells's intimate knowledge of the network, the names of buyers, the locations of secret graves, and the list of victims made him both an indispensable asset to Lizzie and her greatest threat. Wells's position in the gang was deeply complex and conflicted. He enjoyed a degree of freedom and trust that other black members did not, but he was also trapped in a web of crime from which he could not escape. Every family he deceived, every child he led into the trap, was a growing weight on his conscience. This internal conflict between self-preservation and a mounting sense of guilt eventually pushed him to a breaking point. Lizzie controlled Wells with a toxic mix of reward and threat. She gave him money and treated him like a partner, but also frequently reminded him that she was the only one standing between him and the gallows, or worse, being sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. She made him believe their fates were intertwined. If she went down, he would be dragged down with her. This psychological manipulation, combined with a very real fear of Lizzie's retribution, kept Wells silent for years, even as the crimes he was forced to participate in grew ever more monstrous. Isaac Wells would later testify in court that he had witnessed Lizzie Warwick commit murder with her own hands. In one chilling account, he recalled the moment he saw Lizzie carry a young boy, perhaps 5 years old, who was crying inconsolably, to the back of the barn. Minutes later, she returned alone, her face cold and silent. The boy was never seen again. Wells knew exactly what had happened, as he was later forced to help dig a shallow pit in the nearby cypress grove. These murders were not acts of rage. They were cold, calculated business decisions based on profit and risk. A crying child could attract attention. A sick captive would be expensive to care for and difficult to sell. A man who insisted he was free could cause trouble later. For Lizzie, the simplest and most efficient solution was to eliminate the problem. Death was an item on her balance sheet, a way to cut her losses. The unraveling of the Tidewater trap began with this very ruthlessness. Competition in the trafficking underworld was fierce, and Lizzie had built a reputation not just for outsmarting her rivals, but for erasing them. The murder of white traffickers like Caleb Morse both eliminated competition and brought in a huge windfall. As legal pressure mounted, Lizzie's cruel logic dictated that dead witnesses tell no tales. This decision to escalate violence against white victims reflected both Lizzie's arrogance and her fatal miscalculation. She had operated for so long in the shadows, where black lives were disposable, that she believed she could apply the same rules to everyone. She had grossly underestimated the difference in societal reaction to the disappearance of a propertied white man versus that of an anonymous black person. This assumption would prove to be the greatest mistake of her criminal career. In the fall of 1842, the Blackwater River gave up its secrets. A local fisherman, dragging his nets after a storm, snagged a heavy object in the riverbed. When he hauled it up, he found a rusted iron box. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man, later identified by authorities as Caleb Morse, the Tennessee trafficker who had vanished a year earlier. This gruesome discovery triggered a formal investigation, and for the first time, sheriffs from both Virginia and North Carolina cooperated to uncover the secrets buried in the dark corner. The fisherman found the iron box after an unusual flash flood had eroded the riverbank, exposing what had previously been buried deep in the silt. At first, he thought he had found an old treasure chest. It was only when he pried open the rusted lid and was confronted with a human skeleton that he realized the horrifying truth. The iron box was no random container. It was carefully constructed, large enough to hold a folded body, with iron loops on the outside for attaching heavy stones. This level of meticulous preparation indicated that this was not a one-time murder, but part of a calculated and repeated process of body disposal. The discovery of Caleb Morse's body in the fall of 1842 set in motion an unprecedented investigation that would finally bring down Lizzie Warwick. Spurred by pressure from Morse's family and abolitionist activists, Virginia and North Carolina authorities set aside their usual jurisdictional disputes to form a joint task force. The investigation was led by Sheriff William Boone of Southampton County, a man with a reputation for tenacity. Boone secured comprehensive search warrants, allowing him and his men to excavate Warwick's property and Reed's Tavern, a bold legal move at the time. The warrants also established joint jurisdiction, closing the legal loophole the gang had exploited for years. As news of the investigation spread, panic gripped the gang. Knowing he knew too much and could be Lizzie's next target, Isaac Wells made a life-or-death decision. On a late October night, he slipped away from the dark corner and made his way to Sheriff Boone's office. Facing the likelihood of being hanged for his crimes, Wells chose to cooperate. He offered a deal, a full confession about Lizzie Warwick's empire in exchange for leniency. For Sheriff Boone, it was the breakthrough he had been searching for. Wells's testimony would be the key to unlocking the gates of hell that Lizzie had built on the banks of the Blackwater River. Isaac Wells's decision to cooperate was not just about saving his own life, it was an act of atonement. He understood that he had participated in heinous crimes and his testimony could cost him everything. But the weight of his guilt, especially after witnessing the murder of children, had become unbearable. Facing Sheriff Boone, he did not just confess, he purged his soul, breaking the psychological chains Lizzie had held him in for a decade. Wells's testimony painted a hellish picture. Sitting in the sheriff's office in Franklin, Virginia, he recounted in detail years of the gang's operations. He described how Lizzie and Amos Reed had planned the murder of Caleb Morse, poisoning his whiskey before beating him and sinking his body in the river. He told of other rival traffickers who had met similar fates, their bodies dumped in the swamp or buried in nameless graves. But his most horrific revelations were yet to come. The level of detail in Wells's memory was astounding. He provided investigators with a complete map of Lizzie's empire, the secret transport routes, the names of buyers in Mississippi and Alabama, and, most importantly, the precise locations of murdered victims. He didn't just describe the crimes. He gave the sheriff the blueprint of the entire criminal organization. Following Wells's directions, Sheriff Boone and his men began a methodical excavation of Lizzie Warwick's property. In a vegetable patch behind the house, they found the skeletal remains of 2 children. A sobbing Wells confessed that one of them was the boy he had seen Lizzie lead away after he wouldn't stop crying. She had strangled the child to death because she thought his noise would attract attention. Wells didn't know the child's name or the fate of his mother, only that they had been captured together and only the mother had been sold. The discovery of the children's bodies shocked even the most hardened deputies. This was not gang-on-gang violence or a crime of profit. This was pure, cold-blooded cruelty. Lizzie didn't just kill those who threatened her, she killed the weakest and most helpless simply because they were an inconvenience. This murder, more than any other, revealed that Lizzie Warwick was not an ordinary criminal. She was a monster. The excavations continued to yield horrific results. Along the riverbank, Sheriff Boone's team found 3 more iron boxes, all containing human remains. Isaac Wells identified one set of remains as belonging to a rival trafficker named John Tate, whom he had watched Lizzie poison with tainted whiskey at the tavern. The other 2 sets belonged to a free African-American couple who had been targeted by the gang because of a rumor they had saved a small amount of money. Wells recounted that they were killed after refusing to reveal where their money was hidden. The methodical nature of these killings painted a portrait of Lizzie Warwick, not just as a trafficker, but as a calculated serial killer who had operated with ruthless confidence for years. She was shielded by the isolation of the dark corner, the indifference of a racist society, and a network of accomplices bought with profit. The physical evidence corroborated every word of Wells's testimony with chilling accuracy. The iron boxes were of identical construction, suggesting a mass-produced process for body disposal. The burial and dumping sites seemed to follow a morbid logic, carefully chosen to avoid discovery. Some of the skeletons were still bound in chains, a horrifying detail suggesting the victims may have been thrown into the river while still alive. As news of the excavations spread, the wall of silence around the dark corner began to crumble. Neighbors who had once lived in fear now found the courage to speak about what they had seen. Their testimonies confirmed the late-night wagons and the muffled screams. Most crucial of all was the testimony of Hannah Green, the seamstress who had escaped 2 years prior. Her story, previously dismissed by many as exaggeration, was now tragically validated. Hannah's testimony provided invaluable, first-hand insight into the gang's methods of deception. She described in detail how Isaac Wells had approached her with a perfectly crafted job offer that exploited her hopes and desperation. She recounted the promises of a safe community, good wages, and respect, all lies designed to lure her into the trap. Her story transformed the victims from anonymous skeletons into real people with stolen dreams. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the borders of Virginia and North Carolina. Sheriff Boone coordinated with authorities in southern states to track down sales records linked to Amos Reed, attempting to identify the hundreds of victims who had been sold into slavery. A vast criminal network, previously hidden in the shadows, was now being dragged into the light. Just when the story of the dark corner seemed it couldn't get any more horrific, new discoveries continued to plumb the depths of depravity. If this story is haunting you, share it with others who are interested in the hidden corners of history. Hit the like button to help us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light, and don't forget to subscribe to join us for the final chapter in the reign of terror of the specter of the Blackwater River. The cooperation between Virginia and North Carolina, in this case, set a significant precedent for law enforcement. For the first time, states worked together to treat the Tidewater Trap as what it was, an interstate criminal organization. The case drew national press attention, and it highlighted the need for federal-level coordination to combat criminal networks that crossed state lines, a novel concept at the time. On the 10th of October 1842, a Southampton County, Virginia, grand jury composed of white male landowners handed down indictments against Eliza Lizzie Warwick on 6 counts of murder. The indictments, signed by the county prosecutor, were a historic moment. For the first time in the region, a white woman would face justice for the murder of victims who included both black and white individuals. The composition of the grand jury, though limited to privileged white men, reflected a shift in public consciousness. The sheer brutality of the crimes, reinforced by irrefutable physical evidence, had transcended even the deepest racial prejudices. Their willingness to indict Lizzie for the murder of African-American victims, alongside her white victims, marked a small but significant step forward for the justice system. The indictments were stunningly precise, naming the victims, where possible, and the approximate dates of the murders. Warwick was charged with the murders of Caleb Morse in 1841, John Tate in 1840, an unnamed couple in 1839, and 2 unidentified children in separate years. Each count carried a potential death sentence. The case against her was built on solid ground: the skeletal remains, the iron boxes, the detailed testimony of Isaac Wells, and the corroboration of survivors like Hannah Green. This powerful combination of physical evidence and multiple witnesses made Lizzie's defense an all but impossible task. Isaac Wells's testimony was the unshakable foundation of the prosecution's case. His insider knowledge, combined with his ability to lead Sheriff Boone to cold graves and sunken iron boxes, made him the most important witness in the legal history of the Tidewater region. The man who had once been an instrument of crime had now become an instrument of justice, holding the fate of the woman who had manipulated and terrorized him for years. The prosecution team was led by an ambitious young lawyer from Richmond who saw in the Warwick case an opportunity to make a name for himself. He understood that a successful conviction of a white woman for crimes against both white and black people would be a powerful statement about equality before the law, a concept rarely enforced. He was determined to ensure the trial would be a model of justice, sending a clear message to other human hunters lurking in the shadows. But it was Lizzie Warwick herself who was the center of attention. Newspapers from Richmond to Raleigh described her as a figure who defied all stereotypes. Wiry and seemingly frail, she exuded an aura of cold defiance. Nearing 50, she remained sharp-witted and completely unrepentant. Even when confronted with the skeletons exhumed from her own property, she maintained her innocence, calling her victims lawless vagrants who were unworthy of society's protection. Her jailers at the Southampton County Jail painted a portrait of an unremorseful villain. Lizzie seemed to genuinely believe her actions were merely business. She scoffed at the legal proceedings, expressing contempt that the authorities were wasting time and money on people she considered to be merchandise. This attitude shocked the public and solidified her image as a cold-blooded monster. Lizzie's conditions of imprisonment reflected both her notoriety and the fear she inspired. The small county jail was not built to hold a mass murder defendant. She was kept in a separate cell under 24-hour guard to prevent both an escape and the possibility that outside allies might try to silence her. The cell window was reinforced with new iron bars, and all visitors were thoroughly searched. The small town of Franklin lived in a mixture of fear and excitement, awaiting the trial of the century. During the weeks of her confinement awaiting trial, Lizzie Warwick's defiance seemed to crack. Perhaps realizing her fate was sealed, she began to boast of her criminal career to her jailers and a few curious visitors. According to local newspaper accounts, she confessed to being involved in the deaths of nearly 30 people. These victims were not limited to those whose remains had been found, but also included competitors, traitors within the gang, and anyone she deemed a liability. What was most horrifying about these confessions was Lizzie's cold, emotionless detachment. She spoke of poisoning a man or ordering a child to be drowned with the same matter-of-fact tone a farmer might use to discuss culling livestock. Her complete absence of a conscience horrified all who listened, cementing her image as a person of absolute depravity. Her confessions, though informal, confirmed the investigators' worst suspicions. The discovered crimes were just the tip of the iceberg. The legal proceedings were fast-tracked. With undeniable evidence and public pressure demanding a swift verdict, the trial was set for December 1842. News of the demoness of the Dark Corner had spread, and journalists from all over descended on the small town of Franklin to cover the proceedings. The case was billed as the most significant trial in the county's history. The prosecution's strategy was clear. Let the evidence speak for itself. They would present the iron boxes, the skeletons, the rusted shackles. They would have Isaac Wells and Hannah Green tell their stories, and they would let the jury look into the cold eyes of Lizzie Warwick and decide her fate. The defense had almost nothing to work with, save for a possible plea for mercy based on Lizzie's gender, a weak argument against the mountain of evidence of her cruelty. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic trials the state of Virginia had ever seen, but that trial of the century would never happen. On the 28th of November, 1842, just weeks before her trial was set to begin, Lizzie Warwick was found dead in her jail cell. The guards discovered her lying on her cot, her face strangely serene. The official cause of death was ruled as poisoning, likely a suicide. Just as she had lived, Lizzie's death was shrouded in mystery and speculation. Some claimed a loyal ally had smuggled poison to her, while others believed that she, with her cunning, had managed to conceal a dose of poison since her arrest. The discovery of Lizzie's death sent a shockwave through the community. The guards, on their morning rounds, found her motionless. There were no signs of a struggle, and the cell door was still securely locked. The only clue was a faint, bitter almond smell in the air, the classic sign of cyanide. The question of how Lizzie obtained the poison remains a subject of debate to this day. Jail security, though heightened, still had its flaws. It's possible a corrupt deputy or a secret admirer helped her. However, many believe that Lizzie, a master of calculation, had planned her final escape from the beginning. She knew the evidence against her was insurmountable and that she faced the gallows. Rather than suffer a public humiliation, she chose to end her life on her own terms, denying justice its final victory. Her death left a sense of emptiness. The victims' families were denied the closure of seeing their tormentor held accountable in a court of law. However, it also brought an end to the Tidewater trap. Without Lizzie's cunning mind, the criminal organization quickly fell apart. The immediate aftermath was one of controlled chaos. The investigation continued, but without its central figure to prosecute, many of the network's secrets died with Lizzie. Amos Reed had already vanished, believed to have fled to Louisiana or Texas, taking much of the gang's fortune with him, and was never captured. Other lower-level members of the gang either escaped or received lighter sentences. Only Isaac Wells's testimony ensured that at least part of the story was recorded. The fates of Lizzie's key co-conspirators varied. Amos Reed, her partner in business and enforcement, vanished without a trace, likely fleeing to the lawless frontier of Texas or Louisiana with a substantial portion of their ill-gotten gains. Efforts to track him proved futile due to the distances and lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies. He never faced justice. In contrast, Isaac Wells, whose testimony broke the entire conspiracy, was granted a pardon in exchange for his cooperation. The Virginia courts, recognizing his coerced role and his repentance, spared him from the gallows. With the help of abolitionists who had followed the trial closely, Wells was secretly relocated to Ohio. There, he began a new life under a different name. Legend has it that he spent the rest of his life working for the real Underground Railroad, using his intimate knowledge of the routes and tactics of human hunters to help enslaved people find their way to freedom, an act of redemption for his dark past. The subsequent investigation revealed the true scale of the Tidewater trap. Although exact numbers were never determined, historians estimate that Lizzie Warrick's gang was responsible for the kidnapping and sale of between 300 and 600 free African Americans. In economic terms, it was a multi-million-dollar operation by today's standards, but the human cost was immeasurable. Every number in that statistic represented a life destroyed, a family shattered, and a legacy of pain that stretched across generations. Children were stolen from their parents' arms, husbands and wives sold to different masters, never to see each other again. For the free African American communities in the region, Lizzie's reign was a constant reminder that their freedom was as fragile as a thread. The evidence collected also showed that Warrick's network was more than just a local operation. It was a link in a larger criminal supply chain connecting kidnappers in the border states with brokers and plantation owners in the Deep South. The case exposed an entire illicit industry of human trafficking that thrived in the loopholes of the law and the apathy of society. Lizzie Warrick's body was initially buried in an unmarked grave in the corner of the county church cemetery. The community, in an effort to erase the stain she had left, tried to forget her existence. However, her story was too horrific to be forgotten. In a bizarre twist of history, her skull was later exhumed by a local doctor with an interest in phrenology. For decades, it was displayed in a small museum in Norfolk as a specimen of innate depravity, a gruesome reminder of the specter of the Blackwater River. The handling of her remains reflected the public's mixture of revulsion and morbid fascination with her crimes. Lizzie Warrick's legacy extends far beyond her individual actions. Her story is a grim testament to the brutality inherent in the slave system, the fragility of life for free African Americans, and how lawless lands can become breeding grounds for evil. Her Tidewater trap was a dark and venomous mirror image of the Underground Railroad. Instead of leading to freedom, it was a one-way path to the hell of bondage. Modern historians study the Warrick case as a prime example of how organized crime exploited legal loopholes and societal indifference. Her ability to operate for over a decade, in plain sight of local communities, demonstrates the deadly combination of racism, weak law enforcement, and economic greed that allowed such atrocities to persist. The case exposed the severe limitations of the early 19th century justice system, a lack of coordination between states, the absence of professional investigators, and a system that prioritized property over human lives. The lessons learned from the Warrick case contributed to later reforms aimed at strengthening interstate law enforcement cooperation. The impact on the local community was profound and lasting. The name Dark Corner became permanently associated with Lizzie Warrick's crimes. For generations, the area was shunned, haunted by ghost stories of tortured souls at the bottom of the Blackwater River. Many families moved away, and the land carried an invisible scar that never fully healed. The story of Lizzie Warrick remains a cautionary tale of how evil can take root and flourish when good people choose to look away. The Warrick case had profound implications for society's understanding of race, law, and crime. The fact that authorities finally took decisive action, prosecuting a white woman for crimes against both black and white people, was a rare moment of accountability. While it could not change the deeply ingrained racist system, it acknowledged if only for a moment, that the lives of all victims mattered. The story of the Tidewater Trap became a powerful tool in the hands of the abolitionist movement. Activists used the case as irrefutable proof of the cruelty and corruption inherent in the institution of slavery. It showed that the line between legal slavery and illegal kidnapping was perilously thin, and that the existence of slavery created a market for crime that threatened even free people. In the years that followed, the story of Lizzie Warwick blended into the folklore of the Tidewater region, turning her into a mythical figure, a specter of the Blackwater River. The tales were retold in sensationalist newspaper articles and ghost stories, often blurring the line between fact and fiction. The site of the Dark Corner Tavern, though it burned down in a mysterious fire in the 1850 seconds, remained a place that attracted thrill-seekers for generations, a place where it was said you could still hear the clanking of chains and soft weeping on foggy nights. This story shows us how easily society can turn a blind eye to systematic violence when the victims belong to a despised group. The indifference that allowed Lizzie Warwick to build her criminal empire for over a decade was only broken when her crimes spilled over to white victims, whose disappearances forced the system to act. The legal system that failed to protect hundreds of free African Americans from kidnapping and enslavement was the same system that finally pursued Lizzie, but only after she dared to touch the interests of powerful white men. The Warwick case is a profound reminder of the human capacity for evil and the vital importance of justice and community responsibility. It shows how criminal empires can flourish when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Most importantly, it serves as a memorial to the hundreds of victims whose names have been erased by history, but whose stories and suffering must never be forgotten. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Lizzie Warwick's entire network was exposed? The evidence suggests the Tidewater Trap was just one link in a much larger system of illegal human trafficking that stretched across the South. Countless questions remain unanswered about the fate of hundreds of victims and the identities of the powerful men who bought them. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of American history. If you were captivated by this tale and want to explore more horror stories from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with others who love mysteries from our nation's forgotten crimes. See you in the next story, where we will uncover another terrifying page from the shadows of American history.